to present the key results of the Philippines in PISA 2022, covering areas such as learning outcomes and well-being, equity, and investments for education success. Let us all welcome the Undersecretary for Curriculum and Teaching, Dr. Gina O. Gonong.
Thank you very much. Magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming here today. This is going to be the longest presentation I think that I'm going to do in my entire life. But I hope that we all learn from this. Okay? So I'm going to discuss the performance of the Philippines in PISA 2022. It was shown earlier what PISA is about, but allow me to reiterate what PISA is. So PISA is the program for international student assessment is a triennial comparative study around the world that tests 15-year-olds' ability to use their knowledge and skills in reading, mathematics, and science to real-world situations. So PISA does not simply ascertain whether 15-year-old students can reproduce what they have learned. They need to examine, or the PISA examines how well students can extrapolate from what they have learned and apply their knowledge in unfamiliar settings, both in and outside of school. In PISA 2022, the major domain of assessment is mathematics. So that means there are more test items in mathematics, and the contextual factors are focused on mathematics classroom. Why did the Philippines participate in PISA? It is our commitment to international benchmarking in education. There are many uses for PISA assessment, and some of these can be used to indicate how well prepared our students are for learning once they leave school. They identify areas for improvement over time by schools, education systems, and governments, and they allow a comparison of student performance and the learning environment among different countries and economies. This 2022, who took the PISA test in the Philippines? A total of 7,193 15-year-old students from 188 schools, 106 divisions, and 16 regions, which represents 83% of the total population of 15-year-old students in the country completed the test in 2022. That's a high percentage, 83% of our students who are 15-year-olds. The sampling was done using a two-stage sampling design. So the first stage is sampling the schools. When OECD was able to sample the schools, from those schools, the students were sampled. The test was delivered as a computer-based assessment using English as the language of the test. Now, how are scores reported in PISA? Okay, so there are levels in PISA scores, and these scores are located on the PISA scales, and the scales represent varying levels of proficiency. Low proficiency are levels 1C, the lowest is 1C, and then 1B, 1A. Minimum level of proficiency is level 2. The highest proficiency levels are levels 5 and 6. Based on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal, level 2 is the minimum proficiency level that students must achieve in order to fully participate in society. Now let's look at learning outcomes and equity. I will present the average performance of Filipino students in the different domains of assessment in PISA, the descriptions of their performance and performance gaps across subgroups in comparison to the averages of OECD countries and select education systems. Additionally, a comparison between the Philippines' performance in PISA 2018 and 2022 will be presented. How does the Philippines fare in mathematics? So you see the orange shaded part there. That is where the Philippines is at in terms of mathematics. So this graph shows how the Philippines fare against 80 other participating countries and economies in PISA 2022. So we'll see the Philippines as 76th out of 81 countries in mathematics. 5 education systems are below our average: Guatemala, El Salvador, Dominican Republic, Paraguay, and Cambodia. And 2 are at par with our performance: Panama and Kosovo. How does the Philippines fare in mathematics? Let's take a closer look. The OECD average is at level 2. So you see the peach shaded part there. That's level 2. That's the score is 472. At a minimum, students at this level can interpret and recognize without direct instructions how a simple situation can be represented mathematically. The Philippines average is at level 1B. Okay. At a minimum, students at this level can respond to questions involving easy to understand context, which are clearly given in a simple representation. I'll give you a sample item from PISA. So this is a sample of a level 2 item in math. In this item, students are asked to compute the percentage of blue triangles based on 5 rows of the pattern. Since the 5th row is not shown, students have to extend the pattern by 1 row to determine new values for the number of blue triangles and the total number of triangles. With 5 rows, the percentage of blue triangles is 40%. This item is intended to be easy and to get students thinking about extending the pattern beyond what is shown, but not extending the pattern so that it requires generalizing. A typical student from OECD countries has a higher chance of responding correctly to this item compared to a typical Filipino student. That's the minimum. This one is, the next example is a level 5 example. In this item, the task for the students is to evaluate a claim that the percentage of blue triangles in the pattern will always be less than 50% as more rows are added. Students have to select either yes or no to indicate if the claim is or is not true. But they also have to provide an explanation to support their selection. This is a reasoning item that requires students to analyze the pattern to recognize a relationship between the number of red and the number of blue triangles in each row, and then use that relationship to support their selection. Given our average scores in math, a typical Filipino student would find this item very difficult, and his or her chance of responding to this correctly would be quite low. Let's look at reading this time. How does the Philippines fare in reading? The OECD average, which is 476 score points, is at level 2. At a minimum, students at level 2 can identify the main idea in a text of moderate length, find information based on explicit, though sometimes complex criteria, and can reflect on the purpose and form of text when explicitly directed to do so. The Philippines average is at level 1A. At a minimum, students at level 1A can understand literal meaning of sentences or short passages. locate information within short text, and can reflect on the purpose and relative importance of information in simple texts. Let's now look at our science scores. How does the Philippines fare in science? In science, the OECD average is at level 3, 485 score points. At a minimum, students at level 3 can use moderately complex knowledge to explain familiar scientific phenomena and can use procedural or epistemic knowledge to carry out a simple experiment in a constrained context. The Philippine average is at level 1A. At a minimum, these students can use basic knowledge to identify correct explanations for simple scientific phenomena, and with support, these students can undertake scientific investigations with no more than 2 variables. The next slide will show us how the Philippines compare in 2022 to 2018. So there's a bit of good news here. The performance of 15-year-old students in the Philippines in the 3 subject domains remained stable despite the COVID-19 pandemic. In mathematics, there are 2 score points improvement. In reading, there are 7 score points improvement. But in science, there's a drop of 1 point. Okay? While there is an improvement in terms of scores, they are not statistically significant. The levels remain. Okay? So we have not moved out of the levels. But what proportion of students, of Filipino students, achieve the minimum proficiency? Let's look at some good news. So not all Filipino students were not able to achieve the minimum. There were students that were able to achieve the minimum proficiency. There is 16% in mathematics, 24% in reading, 23% in science. So there's hope because we see a percentage of our students reaching the minimum level of proficiency. But we have to work on the more than 75% of our students in the Philippines who are below the minimum level of proficiency in mathematics, science, and reading. This time, allow me to show you the region's performance in PISA 2022. NCR and Region 4A achieved average scores that were statistically higher than the national average in all 3 subjects. Yay! Region, congratulations, RD Willie, RD Joyce, now USEC Willie. Region 10 in reading and math, and Region 9 in math scored statistically lower than the national average. The scores of the remaining regions in all other domains were statistically the same as the national average. So when we look at the average of NCR and 4A in mathematics, their average is 1 proficiency level higher than the national average. NCR and Region 4A are at level 1A. The national average is at level 1B. Now let's compare the regional performance in 2018 and in 2022. So compared to 2018, there was no significant change in the performance of all the regions. The next slide will show us the proportion of students in each region that has achieved the minimum proficiency in mathematics. So again, let's look at this as some good news for us. We have students in regions that are able to achieve the minimum proficiency level, minimum and above. So NCR, CAR, and Region 4A have the largest shares of students who have reached the minimum level of proficiency in reading, science, and math. And in NCR, some 1% of our students reached level 5 in mathematics. So it's like a Singapore performance, level 5 in mathematics. Okay? So there are good news. Parang medyo nakakahinga tayo kapag nakakarinig, kahit na bit of good news. But of course, we cannot forget the 75 to 80% of our students that need help. Now let's look at the proportion of students in each region that has achieved the minimum proficiency in reading. So again, NCR, CAR, and Region 4A are consistent. NCR, CAR, and Region 4A have the largest share of students who have reached the minimum level of proficiency in reading, science, and math. Almost half of students in NCR and 2 in every 5 students in CAR achieved at least the minimum proficiency in reading. Okay, so again, that's a bit of good news. But when you look at the graph, you see some students achieving level 6 and level 5. We need to know what they are doing or what their schools are doing or what their teachers are doing, why they are able to achieve level 6, 5, and 4. Now let's look at contextual variables. There's another one, which is science. Okay, so this is achievement in science. Same regions, NCR, CAR, and Region 4A have the largest shares of students who have reached the minimum level of proficiency in reading, science, and math. At least 2 in every 5 students in NCR and CAR achieved level 2 or above in science. In NCR, some 1% reached level 5. So may pag-asa po tayo. We're hopeful. Okay? That 1% will need to become Okay. Next is, I'll talk about contextual variables that contribute to performance outcomes. So performance gap within the Philippines in terms of socio-economic differences. Students from socio-economically advantaged homes, we know this already, scored better than their disadvantaged peers in math, reading, and science. There's a huge score difference, especially in reading and science. So mathematics, 36 score points, reading 52 score points, science 51 score point difference. But there's a bit of good news here. Some 12% of disadvantaged students in the Philippines were able to score in the top quarter of mathematics performance in the country. Okay, let's look at gender this time. Girls, as expected, as usual, girls outperform. Okay, I need to say this in a matter-of-fact way. Girls outperformed boys in all 3 domains of assessments. The average scores of girls in math and reading were in level 1A, while boys are at level 1B. Both boys and girls were at level 1A in science. But comparing the 2022 results with 2018, there was no significant change in the performance between boys and girls in math and science. And in reading, the difference decreased by 8 score points. This time, let's look at the performance of private schools versus public schools. Students attending private schools scored higher than those in the public schools. Students in the private schools were at level 1A in math and science, while public school students were at level 1B. In reading, students in private schools were at level 2, while students in the public schools were at level 1B. You'll see the scores in the table at the right side. So the score differences are huge. At this point, let me talk about well-being and investments for education. This is a snapshot of how learning continued in the Philippines during the pandemic, describing how schools and students responded to the educational disruptions and its effect on students' learning and well-being. I will also cover how investments in education are related. How investments in education are related to student performance and well-being. Let's look at students' sense of belonging at school and satisfaction with life. Compared to 2018, students' sense of belonging at school declined in the Philippines. Similar to many countries and economies, student satisfaction with life declined in the Philippines, and 70% reported that they were not satisfied with their lives. The next slide shows us learning during COVID-19 pandemic. Students in the Philippines reported varying experiences with remote learning, but they generally reported a more positive experience with learning at home in comparison to the OECD countries on average. Okay? That's a bit of good news. And what contributes to the positive experience of learners during the COVID-19 disruption? When we look at the graph here, you have 83% of students responding that their teachers were well prepared to provide instruction remotely, and I improved my skills in using digital devices for learning purposes. So the positive experience can be attributed to teacher support and digital resources. Okay, the next slide is on, again, a continuation of learning during the pandemic. During remote learning, students in the Philippines encountered challenges, more so among girls compared to their counterparts from OECD countries. Although these challenges were not associated with a decrease in math scores. So when you look at the challenges that were reported here, 2% said that they had problems with motivating themselves to do schoolwork. And 41% said they had problems with understanding their school assignments. Let's look at the use of digital devices. 15-year-olds in the Philippines spend approximately a total of 10.7 hours per day on digital resources, whether for learning activities, which is 6 hours, or leisure, 4.7 hours. We see the comparison of time spent on digital resources per day on the table at the right side. A 1-hour increase in the time spent per day on digital devices for learning at school had increased mathematics score by 3 points, but decreased by 4 points when used for leisure. So digital devices used for learning, there is an increase in performance. Digital devices used for leisure decrease by 4 points. The next slide shows us the language at home. Only 7% of our students who participated in PISA reported that they speak English at home most of the time. In PISA 2022, students who speak English at home most of the time scored significantly lower than those who speak a language other than English in all assessment domains. Both groups, however, we're talking about an increase in score points, but not an increase in level, so the same level of proficiency for both groups. Performance differences based on language at home were not observed in 2018. The next slide shows us the teacher support in math classes. The level of support provided by teachers to their students in the Philippines was higher, significantly higher, than the OECD countries on average. Students who were attending classes with supportive teacher in most or every mathematics lesson scored from 17 to 27 points higher than those who received lesser support. Okay? This shows us the power of good teaching, okay, or good teachers. Let's look at disciplinary climate in math classes. There seems to be a need for our math teachers to improve their classroom management skills. A considerable proportion of students reported that they study mathematics in a disciplinary climate that is not favorable to learning. So when we look at the graph here, 41% of our students are distracted by using digital devices. 38% get distracted by other students who are using digital devices. 34%, this is on classroom management, the teacher has to wait a long time for students to quiet down. 30%, students do not start working for a long time after the lesson begins. And then 30%, I'm looking at the second from the bottom, there is noise and disorder in their classrooms. Let's look at safety at this point, feeling safe at and around school. The index of feeling safe at school was relatively low in the Philippines compared to the OECD countries on average. And the feeling of being unsafe was more common among girls than boys. For each unit increase in the index of feeling safe at school, there was a 9-point increase in students' performance in mathematics after accounting for socioeconomic profiles of both students and schools. Okay, so 19% of our students said, I feel safe at other places at school. So that's just 19%. I feel safe in my classrooms at school. That's a small 8%. I feel safe on my way home from school. That's 10%. I feel safe on my way to school. That's only 8%. Related to this is bullying. The incidence of bullying in schools in the Philippines had decreased between 2022 and 2018. However, it remained a pervasive problem, more so among boys and those in public schools. Okay? Maybe because they were not in their classrooms, that's why they were not bullied. Okay? But almost 1 in every 3 students reported experiencing bullying at school at least once a week. Students who experienced bullying at least a few times a month scored 11 to 44 points lower in mathematics. Okay? The next one is student truancy. When we speak of student truancy, this is about how many times student had skipped classes or days of schools 2 weeks prior to the PISA test. So at least 1 in every 4 students reported having skipped at least 1 class or day in school, with a higher prevalence among socio-economically advantaged students, boys, and those attending public schools. Students who reported having skipped at least a class or day of school scored 25 points lower in mathematics. The next slide is on long-term absenteeism. So long-term absenteeism is defined as having missed school for more than 3 months in a row. The incidence of long-term absenteeism in the Philippines was almost 4 times higher than the OECD countries on average. It was more commonly reported among boys and students in the public schools. And these are the reasons. At the right side, we see the reasons why students miss schools. I had to take care of a family member, that's 59%. I had to help with work at home, the family business, that is 53%. I was bored, that's 45%. School was closed because of a natural disaster, that is 44%. So family situations, being bored, and school closures remained as the primary reasons for long-term absenteeism. Let's look at grade repetition. 1 in every 4 students repeated a grade at least once, more so among boys and those in public schools. They were the ones who were truant, low achievers, bullied, and had a low sense of belonging at school. And students who reported a grade students who repeated a grade at least once in elementary or secondary school scored lower by 53 and 57 points in mathematics. Let's go now to student-teacher ratio and class size. The average student-teacher ratio in the Philippines increased from 26 in 2018 to 30 in 2022. This was higher than the OECD average of 12. Similar to 2018, the average class size in the Philippines was 43, which is higher than the OECD average, which is 26. Both the student-teacher ratio and class size was higher in public schools than in private schools in the Philippines. So 28 in public for average student-teacher ratio, private is 22 for class size, 43 in public, for private that is 40. Education systems that reported lower student-teacher ratios and smaller class size generally showed higher mathematics scores. Let's now move to parental involvement in school-related activities. So similar with 2018, parental involvement in school-related activities was still high in the Philippines compared to OECD countries on average. So we have principals reporting that at least half of all families are involved in school-related activities. And some of those here, 92% participated in local school government, 83% discussed their child's progress on the initiative of one of their child's teachers. Next is parental support. So it seems that parental involvement is different from parental support. So there are descriptions on parental support given at the table here. Students in more supportive homes were more likely to perform better in mathematics. 1 unit increase in the index of family support in the Philippines was associated with a 13-point increase in the mathematics score of students after accounting for their socioeconomic profile and their school socioeconomic profile. So these are the activities that show family support. At 44%, eat the main meal with you, the family eating meals together. At 33%, spend time just talking with you. At 28%, encourage you to get good marks. 21% talk to you about the importance of completing upper secondary. Okay. Like 18% at the top here, ask what you did in school that day. The next slide will show us something about shortage of educational staff. The percentage of students in the Philippines that were in schools whose principal reported that the school's capacity to provide instruction is hindered by a lack of teaching staff and by inadequate or poorly qualified teaching staff had increased between 2018 and 2022. In 2018, the corresponding proportions were 19% and 8%. A 1-unit increase in the index of shortage of education staff resulted in a decrease in math score by 6 score points before accounting for the students and schools' socio-economic profiles. So this is based on the report of principals. So 43% of them reported a lack of teaching staff, 32% a lack of assisting staff, inadequate or poorly qualified teaching staff, 22% inadequate or poorly qualified, should be 19% inadequate or poorly qualified teaching staff, 19%. Let's look at shortage of educational materials and its effect on performance. The index of shortage of educational material in the Philippines was relatively high compared to the OECD countries on average. At least half of the students were in schools whose principal reported that the school's capacity to provide instruction is hindered by a lack of educational materials or inadequate or poor educational materials. A 1-unit increase in the index of shortage of educational material resulted to a decrease in mathematics performance by 4 score points. At this point, let's look at teacher qualifications. We have a high number of fully certified teachers in the Philippines. That means in the Philippines, these are licensed teachers because certification is different across countries in the world. In the Philippines, it is via the licensure examination for teachers. So the number of fully certified teachers in the Philippines was higher in the Philippines than in OECD countries. But OECD countries on average had more teachers with specialized education. And they possess post-baccalaureate degrees or master's degrees. Okay, now let's look at attendance to the pre-primary education. While the majority of Filipino students, specifically girls, students from advantaged backgrounds and students from private schools reported having attended pre-primary education for at least 1 year, the percentage of those who had not attended increased between 2018 and 2022. Okay? And that is most likely because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Students who attended pre-primary education for at least 1 year but less than 2 years scored 26 points higher than those who did not attend or attended for less than a year. Next one is on food security. 12% of our students reported that they came to school without eating every day or almost every day. These are our 15-year-old students. 12% reported that they have not eaten every day or almost every day. They eat 4 to 5 times a week, 3%, 2 to 3 times a week, 9%, about once a week, 15%. Food insecurity was found to be associated with mathematics performance. So pag gutom ang bata, mababa ang performance sa math. Education spending. This is the last on contextual variables. So when you look at the graph here, the average spending per student in the Philippines is 9 times lower than that across OECD countries. Okay. So that suggests that countries, developing countries such as the Philippines, are often under-resourced. That ends the contextual variable presentations. My next slide is on policy and practice options. Considering the findings in PISA 2022, there are some policy and practice options that we're sharing with you. On learning outcomes, provide sufficient support for high-quality teaching and learning by increasing teacher capacity so they can better support students. Engage parents as educational allies by encouraging at-home parental support to reinforce student learning. For well-being, create a safe, inclusive, supportive, and connected school climate. Implement and enforce consistent and comprehensive truancy tracking policy and procedures to ensure that school-age children are in schools. Equity, ensure that adequate learning resources are made available, accessible, and equitable, especially for those vulnerable and disadvantaged children. And investments for education success, protect education spending, and increase investment in education to meet the pressing demands in our education system. So before I end, I just would like to emphasize that there are reforms that DepEd is currently undertaking, and they are in the banner of our Matatag education agenda. We have the National Learning Recovery Program. We're pilot implementing the Matatag curriculum. We're strengthening the professional development of teachers and their career progression. And we're removing non-teaching tasks, among others. To end, education is not just the business of the Department of Education. To be successful, to improve learning outcomes, to improve our performance, there has to be a multi-sectoral approach. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening.
Thank you, Yusek Guano, for presenting the salient findings of the Philippines in PISA 2022.